Hello, my name is Stephanie, and welcome, or if you're coming back, welcome back. Either way, I'm glad you're here, and I hope you're well. And today we're talking about the strange Star Wars sequel that never was, Splinter of the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster. So spoilers for the aforementioned book, as well as just general Star Wars saga spoilers. Before we get into Splinter of the Mind's Eye, we gotta go back in time for a brief-ish history lesson. It is 1976 and Star Wars is in production, and to say there are concerns would be putting it mildly. Today, Star Wars is this massive titan of pop culture that is literally worth billions of dollars, and has not one, but two theme parks. But in 1976, that was definitely not the case. I talked about this in my video about weird Dune merchandise, but it is, of course, relevant here. And to make a very long story short, George Lucas was trying to get his weird space western made after the surprise hit that was American Graffiti. He got turned down by several studios. I talked about this in my Dune video also, but can you imagine being one of the studios that passed on Star Wars? In hindsight, it's a hell of a thing. But eventually, 20th Century Fox was willing to take a chance on the movie, despite fiction not being a very profitable genre at the time, and offered to finance what would become A New Hope for $5 million in 1975. However, by 1976, after a problem-laden production, literally production fell behind schedule the very first week of filming. That's how this thing started out. Star Wars was $3 million over budget, and Fox was starting to worry that it was going to be a box office bomb. So what does that have to do with Splinter of the Mind's Eye? Everything. It's why it exists at all. That same year, 1976, Alan Dean Foster was contracted to write 2 Star Wars books. Each of those 2 books would become the first Star Wars book ever, and it was the novelization for the upcoming movie, which was then titled Star Wars From the Adventures of Luke Skywalker. In later years, it would be republished as Star Wars A New Hope to reflect the addition of a subtitle being added to the original Star Wars movie. But it began its life as a former. And it is a really interesting book in terms of Star Wars history, but that's a longer conversation for another time. It also has one of the best Star Wars covers of all time, in my opinion. I just think it's really cool. The novelization is credited to George Lucas, but it was ghostwritten by Alan Dean Foster. The second book would become Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which was meant to serve as a sequel to the upcoming Star Wars movie. In print form, if a sequel was never greenlit due to the movie flopping, again, most everyone at this point was convinced that it would, or as the basis for and I cannot emphasize this enough, very low-budget sequel on the unlikely chance that they actually got to make another movie. Thus, Splinter of the Mind's Eye was born. Alan Dean Foster was basically given free rein to write whatever he wanted as long as he reused as many props from the original film as possible to keep costs down in the event that they got to make another movie. So, that's how we got here. Let's talk about Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the Star Wars sequel that never was. Splinter of the Mind's Eye picks up soon after the end of what would become A New Hope, and in it we find Luke, Leia, R2, and C-3PO headed to the planet Mimban in order to recruit for the Rebel Alliance. Han and Chewbacca are not with them, nor are they mentioned, nor do they appear in this book at all. And that's because, at the time, Harrison Ford hadn't signed on for any potential sequels, and at the time, no Han meant no Chewbacca. However, things quickly go sideways when this massive energy surge from the planet hits their 2 ships. Luke and Leia are each piloting their own ship. Energy surge causes their ships to short-circuit and crash onto the surface of Mimban. This was originally supposed to be a space battle between the 2 of them and the Empire, but Alan Dean Foster was asked to change it because space battles are expensive. But regardless of how they got there, Luke, Leia, and the 2 droids are now crashed and stranded on Mimban, as their ships were badly damaged when they crashed to the surface of the planet. Mimban is a swampy, muddy, misty, very sparsely populated planet, and again, this has its origins in Splinter of the Mind's Eye being a very low-budget sequel, and this would have been fairly easy, and most importantly, fairly cheap, to create on screen if they got to make another movie. And I'm going to talk more about the current Star Wars canon at the end of all this, but Mimban is very much still like this in the current canon, which I think is kind of funny. Thankfully, everyone is unhurt, but like I said, their ships are badly damaged and stuck in the mud, so they're not going anywhere. Leia thankfully managed to locate a homing beacon before she crashed, and she thinks their best bet is to make the trek and call for help so that they can get off the planet as soon as possible. However, like I said, Mimban is pretty sparsely populated, so Luke isn't sure they'll find anything or anyone, which Leia admits is very possible, but given that they're in a snake-filled swamp, literally, this is their best option. With that, they manage to dig their packs out of the ships and set off in search of the beacon. So, they make their way through the muck and the mud for several days before finally coming to the homing beacon site, which is way more advanced than anything else around it. So advanced that it looks weirdly out of place. Much so that Luke and Leia realize that they're not the only outsiders who are on Mimban. Two figures were swaying down the center of the street. They wore armor instead of loose clothing, formed armor of white and black. Armor that was all too familiar. Both men carried their helmets casually. One dropped his, bent to retrieve it, kicked it accidentally up the street. His companion chided him. Cursing, the clumsy Imperial picked up his helmet, and the two continued down their meandering path. Because, yeah, the Empire is also on Mimban, and seems to, if the homing beacon station is anything to go by, have a pretty significant presence on the planet. And given that they're the Empire's most wanted for blowing up the Death Star, Luke and Leia break into a nearby clothing shop and steal some clothes to disguise themselves, and they disguise themselves as a miner and his slave girl, respectively. Yeah, so this is as good a time as any to talk about the way Luke and Leia are characterized in this book, because it's something. Let me preface what I'm about to say by saying this. Alan Dean Foster started writing this before Star Wars was even out in theaters, and was going off of the information that had been given to him by George Lucas. I say that it's pretty clear that neither of them knew who these characters were going to be yet. And so to us in the present, they seem kind of out of character, because they weren't yet the characters they were going to become, the characters that we all know. I say all that to say there's a lot of sexual tension between Luke and Leia. Like, a lot. And look, I know Alan Dean Foster didn't know, and hell, George Lucas didn't know that they were going to be brother and sister yet. That's why you shouldn't pick your Star Wars ships before the last movie comes out, because there were Luke and Leia weddings. Return of the Jedi comes out, and then what do you do? What do you do? I'm genuinely asking because I've always wondered, what do you do? I know that they didn't know yet that Luke and Leia were going to be brother and sister, but I know. And you know. We all know. And knowing that makes for a very uncomfortable reading experience, especially when we get to the mud wrestling scene. Yes, really. I'm sorry. As Luke and Leia make their way through the very small settlement, they watch the Imperials pretty carefully, and they realize that the Empire is using the miners on Mimban rather than their own people to mine something on the planet, something they want to keep secret, which is all the more reason they need to get off the planet so that they can tell the Alliance and the other planets in the system what's going on, hoping that telling the latter will bring the planets over to their cause. But first, they actually need to get off the planet and avoid being found by the Empire. As they make their way through the settlement, they do their best to try and blend in and lay low. And in doing so, they find themselves in a bar where they decide to get something to eat, because again, they've been stuck on this planet for several days, eating kind of ration packs at this point. They decide to get some actual hot food, sit down, and figure out what their next move is going to be, and hopefully not draw too much attention to themselves. So naturally, someone notices them immediately. So we are introduced to my favorite original character in this book, Halla, who is a loud, eccentric, older woman who literally walks up to them and sits at their table. And it is clear from the jump that she doesn't really buy their really weak story of having come in on the last ship onto the planet, but she isn't going to turn them in. Instead, she needs their help. And not only does she need their help, she knows that Luke is strong in the Force, so he's definitely the one that she wants to help her out with what she's doing. Help you do what? Luke queried in confusion. Just help, she said, casually cryptic. You help me, I help you. And I know you need help because there are no strangers on this world, and yet you're here. Know how I know you're strangers? She leaned over the table again and wagged a knowing finger at Luke. Because, young man, is strong within you. Immediately and super convincingly is like, the Force? That's just some crazy story. And even if it was real, I definitely don't have it. We're just a simple miner and his slave girl. Shockingly, Halla doesn't believe this and says that she can sense the Force in him because she too is Force sensitive. Not only that, in her words, she is a master of the Force. Now, given that this is a random stranger in a bar, Luke and Leia are understandably a little bit skeptical, but Halla is very insistent, and provides a demonstration by using the Force of what the book calls a spice shaker on the table. So I always picture like a McCormick shaker that says melange, do with that what you will. And Luke is like, awesome, I'm convinced. What do you need our help with, stranger? Literally. Convinced, Luke confessed with a curious look towards the curious princess, a look that said he was anything but impressed by her parlor tricks. I love him with all my heart. Know that. Leia is a little more cautious, but agrees that they should at least hear Halla out. Halla needs their help with is finding an ancient crystal called the Kaiburr crystal, spelled like this, you should see it somewhere on screen with me now, which is what the Empire is mining for on Mimban. They're mining practices that caused the energy surge that made the ships crash. So why does the Empire want this crystal? Because it's an incredibly powerful Force relic that can not only magnify someone's Force ability, but also deepen their connection to the Force, heal people, and even project Force lightning Sheev style. It's incredibly powerful, so yeah, given that the Empire just lost the Death Star, it makes sense that they'd be searching for the Kaiburr crystal. Put a pin in that. The Kaiburr crystal is also a myth, which Leia points out, but Halla insists that it's real, and she even has proof. A small shard of the crystal which she gives to Luke. And there's nothing especially unusual about the crystal. It's literally just a crystal that kind of glows, but Halla insists that it's the real deal. Peered closer for a good look, the princess did the same. What they saw was a splinter of something that looked like red glass and glowed softly. The color was a deeper, richer red corundum, a vitreous luster resembling crystallized honey. Being skeptical of Halla, her story, and her crystal, Luke and Leia agree to help her find and protect the crystal if she helps them find a way off-planet, which she is equally skeptical about given the significant Imperial presence on Mimban. And that brings us, unfortunately, to the mud wrestling. So Luke, Leia, and Halla are leaving the bar to go collect R2 and 3PO, and they're doing a good job of not drawing attention to themselves. Hell, they even pass by an Imperial officer on their way out of the bar, and he doesn't even glance at them. And then while they're literally in the doorway of the bar, Leia kicks Luke in the shin as payback for the slave girl story. Causes Luke to trip and then fall into the mud, which he then proceeds to pull her down into the mud with him. And listen, if this book had been written with the knowledge that Luke and Leia were brother and sister, this could have been a fun little hint that they're siblings and even kind of showed that bond and relationship. But the book was very much not written with that knowledge because that knowledge didn't exist at the time. However, I am cursed with that knowledge, and I was so relieved when they were arrested for causing a disturbance, I'm not gonna lie. As you can imagine, two people wrestling in the mud in the doorway of a bar is drawing a lot of attention even before the Imperials show up. And people are staring because part of Leia's clothing had come undone in the wrestling, and she tells them that everything is fine, this is a private matter, nothing to see here and all that. But some people in the crowd take an interest in the two of them. They've realized that Luke and Leia are not registered citizens of Mimban as they don't have the name tags. And they decide they're going to citizen arrest them because they're creeps. One of them is named Jake. Yes, really. But Luke is not going anywhere without a fight and immediately pulls out and ignites his lightsaber. Most of the people watching have the sense to take off because, yeah, if a guy pulls out a laser sword, you probably shouldn't stick around. But a few of them, including Jake, decide to F around and find out, as the youth say, and they, excuse the language, get their asses handed to them by both Luke and Leia, the latter of which literally jumps on a dude and claws at his face. I don't love the way Leia is written in this book at times, but that's iconic. And then the stormtroopers show up to break up the fight. Your weapons, the sergeant in charge ordered them sharply, the angular markings on his armored sleeve showing triple in the dim light. Marks crossed his helmet. You are remanded to custody in the name of the Empire, fighting with weaponry in a public place. As soon as the miners had reacted or otherwise holstered their various weapons, they'd all drawn blasters at this point, Luke shut off his saber. 2 troopers came forward and collected the small arsenal. The princess noticed her one victim recovering consciousness and kicked him soundly. "You there, stop that," the sergeant orders. "Sorry," she replied sweetly. Again. Icon behavior. R2 and 3PO managed to slip away in the chaos, but Luke and Leia and the miners they were fighting with are arrested and taken to a giant ziggurat that serves as the jail. Probably so they could reuse the Yavin set if a movie got made. They're interrogated and keep up the miner and his servant story, which Captain Supervisor Grammel, yes, that's really his title, doesn't really buy and is about to have their identification checked. Something the stormtroopers who arrested them didn't bother with, but he's called away with something else before he can. But Luke and Leia realize they're on borrowed time because, yeah, they don't have any identification, and they need to get out of here. Especially when Grammel comes back and says the miners that started the fight are guilty of starting the fight, which, yeah, fair. As punishment, he's going to dock them a 1.5 period's pay. One of them protests. Grammel, in a surprisingly gruesome scene for a Star Wars book, stabs him in the eye. He then very coldly dismisses them. But Luke and Leia are sent to a holding cell and their identification is to be run. Luke lies and says they lost it in the fight, but again, Grammel isn't buying what he's selling. And when he starts kicking Leia for calling him a moron, Luke admits that they don't have any identification because they're low-level criminals on the run after crossing some more powerful, well-connected people. And in their desperation, Luke says they even sunk so low as to consider joining the Rebel Alliance. He's really laying it on thick here, and I love it. And it also kind of works. But while Grammel somewhat believes this story, they're far from out of trouble, because Luke is in possession of something very interesting. But not what you're thinking. Grammel isn't interested in Luke's lightsaber. He's interested in something else. I stated, everything you've told me is possible and unlikely, the captain supervisor went on. He eyed Luke in a funny way. There is one thing which does interest me, however. It would be a sign of your good faith if you were honest with me about it. I don't understand, Captain Supervisor, Luke admitted blankly. I'm told, Grammel continued, that you have in your possession a small gemstone. Luke froze. Luke doesn't want to give up Halla and potentially get her in trouble. He finally tells Grammel how to open the box that the shard is in when he threatens to hurt Leia. And Grammel is very, very interested in the crystal, but doesn't seem to know exactly what it is or even what he's looking at. But he confiscates it nonetheless, and orders Luke and Leia to be sent to a maximum security holding cell. And the stormtrooper is reluctant to take them. Cell is already occupied, and the occupant keeps putting other people they put in the cell in the hospital. But Grammel is like, yeah, that's the point, lock them up. As it turns out, they're sharing a cell with 2 Yuuzhans. I've no idea if I'm saying that right. I'm just going to take a shot in the dark here. These massive, hairy, humanoid-ish aliens with long snouts named Hin and Ki. I found out they look like this, but I always picture Dr. Zaius from the original Planet of the Apes. Do with that what you will, I don't know why. And Luke immediately makes friends with them. He tells Leia that he used to study for fun out of boredom on Tatooine. I love this detail and it's canon to me, so he knows how to greet them in a way that doesn't offend them, and the 4 of them are now best friends. He tells Luke that they were taken from their home planet and forced into what was essentially indentured servitude on the mines of Mimban, because they're incredibly strong. Put a pin in all that. And for a while they tolerated things, but eventually they got fed up and started fighting back, which is how they ended up in jail. Also because they were very, very drunk and causing a disturbance. And because they're now friends, when Grammel comes to interrogate Luke and Leia, telling them that an Imperial governor is actually on his way to the planet, and he wants to know exactly who they are, because Imperial governors don't come planet-side to see common thieves, which causes Leia to flash back to her imprisonment and torture on the Death Star, and she has a panic attack, which causes Hin and Ki to attack Grammel. Icons, honestly. The attack thankfully delays more questioning, as Grammel is eager to get away from the 2 of them as they keep trying to rip his head off. Again, icon behavior. And not long after they're finally fed, they've been locked up for hours at this point, Halla arrives. She's outside the jail, and Luke can hear her through a little window in the hallway, and together she and Luke use the Force to throw one of their food trays at a panel on the wall which opens the cell. Free from the cell, Luke, Leia, Hin, and Key are able to escape, taking out a bunch of stormtroopers, wrecking the jail, and getting Luke's lightsaber back in the process. Once they're free and reunited with Halla, R2, and 3PO, the 5 of them flee into the swamp in search of the ancient temple where the crystal is supposed to be hidden, at least according to local legends. According to the records I managed to get a look at, they're not classified or anything. This Pomojema was a minor god, but the one who was supposed to be able to give his priests the ability to perform miraculous feats, healing the sick and stuff like that. Of course, half the Mimbanian gods were supposed to be capable of miracles. Nobody wants his neighbor's god to have a bigger reputation than his own. But with Pomojema, these legends could hold some truth. The Kaiburr crystal could be the basis for those stories. And in the way he reacted to the shard that Luke had, they now have confirmation that Grammel and his group are definitely looking for the crystal too. But they fully intend on using it as a weapon, so they need to find it before the Empire does. For time reasons, I'm going to kind of rapid fire these next bits, so just stay with me here. While in the swamp, the group is attacked by a giant worm, discover a lost underground city whose villagers, the Conway, challenge Luke to gladiatorial combat, which he wins. They then join forces with the group and agree to help them, but during the celebratory feast, Luke senses a familiar and very terrifying presence in the Force. Coming, he murmured, every letter resounding. He is near, very near. Luke, boy, you'd better start making some sense, or I'll have Hin hold you down and feed you dip quills. Halla said, who's coming? There was a stirring, Luke whispered by way of a reply. A profound disturbance in the Force. I felt it before, weakly. I felt it most strongly when Ben Kenobi was killed. Leia inhaled in terror, her eyes widening. Not him again. Not here. Vader has arrived on Mimban. When Luke and Leia were captured by Grammel, he contacted Governor Asada, the local Imperial puppet governor, who in turn contacted Darth Vader, who probably heard the words lightsaber and Kaiburr crystal and made a beeline for the planet. And it's not long before a Conway villager comes running into the center of town and tells them that an Imperial squad, led by Vader and Grammel, are cutting their way through the swamp in a massive crawler, and it won't be long before they're upon the village. And Luke realizes if he can sense Vader, Vader can probably sense him. And while the Conway are strong and very skilled warriors, this is an entire squadron of stormtroopers with much more advanced weapons. So if Vader knows they're here, and they can't run, they have no choice but to stand and fight. Like I mentioned earlier, Leia is still very much suffering from the torture she endured on the Death Star, and I like when Star Wars media acknowledges her trauma. Bloodline by Claudia Gray does a phenomenal job of this, in my opinion, because Leia was tortured both physically and mentally, and that was before being forced to watch her entire planet, her parents, everything she has ever known be annihilated. That's traumatic, and she's still suffering from the after effects of that. So before Vader arrives, Leia tells Luke that she's not going to let herself be taken and tortured again, and makes Luke promise that if it looks like they're going to be taken, that he'll kill her. It should come to that, Luke. Come to what? Being taken alive. He indicated understanding, and she went on. Promise me that out of any feeling for the rebellion, out of any feeling you might have for me, that you'll put that saber at your hip to my throat. It has some very wild shifts in tone. But before we have time to process any of that, Vader, Grammel, and their squadron arrive. But the combined forces of Luke, Leia, Halla, the Conway, Hin, and Key are able to beat them back, causing Vader, Grammel, and the surviving stormtroopers to flee. The battle itself is not super graphic or anything like that, but afterwards the Conway actually go around and kill the wounded. And this book has some wild shifts in tone. Safe distance away from the village, Vader kills Grammel for his failure and heads for the temple and the crystal. He's able to sense where it is through the Force, so Luke, Leia, Hin, and Key, and Halla chase after in an attempt to stop him. Somehow they're able to beat Vader to the temple. He's still got the crawler, probably the same sandcrawler from A New Hope for budget reasons, that transported the troopers, and they're on foot, but they still managed to beat him to the temple. Don't worry about it. The group has made it to the temple. Once they're inside, they found the temple has been mostly abandoned, housing only a large sacrificial well, a statue of the god, which is kind of a frog-like deity, as well as a massive pit underneath the statue that they can see a glow coming from. The crystal. They can reach the crystal, however, they are attacked by this toad-like monster, but Luke is able to use the Force to knock a pillar onto it, and they are able to get the crystal. It's then that Vader arrives and starts using the Force to bring the temple crashing down on them. He kills Key in the process and traps Luke under a massive pile of rubble. Halla is too transfixed by the crystal to do anything, so Leia takes up Luke's lightsaber and starts dueling Vader. We love to see it, honestly. Sadly, she gets wounded pretty badly in the battle, but before Vader can kill her, a badly wounded he uses the last of his strength to free Luke from the rubble, where he dies. Leia tosses the saber back to him, and Luke takes up the fight against Vader. And with his abilities being enhanced by the Kaiburr crystal and aided or possibly possessed, the wording is a little strange, by the ghost of Ben Kenobi, Luke is able to cut off Vader's arm and he falls into the sacrificial well. Vader doesn't die, but he's badly wounded and trapped in a hole, so he's no threat to them, at least at the moment. Exhausted and badly wounded, Luke and Leia collapse and pass out. They're both very near dead at this point. Vader brought down enough rubble that the entrance to the temple is now inaccessible and thus safe from the Empire and anyone else. Luke and Leia survived their wounds due to the healing powers of the crystal which Halla had gotten out of the temple. R2 is able to hijack the crawler like the icon he is, and Luke, Leia, Halla, R2, and 3PO head into the Mimban jungle and on to their next adventure. Thus, we find ourselves back at the beginning. So, Alan Dean Foster was contracted to write Splinter of the Mind's Eye in 1976, before Star Wars was released, at a time when it was an over-budget production that looked like it might be a massive flop. But Star Wars wasn't a flop. And it wasn't a hit. It was the hit. By the time Splinter of the Mind's Eye was published in February 1978, Star Wars had broken box office records and was, for the time, the highest grossing film of all time. And so Splinter of the Mind's Eye was abandoned in favor of The Empire Strikes Back. But, again, I talked about this in my Dune merchandise video, but of course it is relevant here. People were absolutely desperate for anything Star Wars after the movie came out. Kenner was able to sell literal toy IOUs, so while it didn't get to be the sequel it was intended to be, Splinter of the Mind's Eye became a massive bestseller, and it also became the first installment of what would become the Star Wars Expanded Universe. Expanded Universe, the EU, included all the stories that made up the Star Wars universe in just about every form you can think of. Books, comics, video games, cartoons, audio dramas, toys, and of course, the original 6 films. And while Splinter of the Mind's Eye wasn't the first Star Wars book, it launched this massive media and genre-spanning universe, and I think that's a hell of a thing. Then, in 2014, Disney bought Star Wars, and everything. Books, comics, video games, spin-off TV movies, cartoons, everything that made up the EU that was created before February 25th, 2014, the day that a new film trilogy was announced, was made non-canon. What that means is that everything except the original 6 films and the Clone Wars TV series were no longer canon, with everything else that was a part of the EU rebranded as Star Wars Legends. You might see reprints of the old books and comics with this gold Legends banner across the top, meaning that that particular story is no longer considered canon, as a new canon was being established. And listen, to editorialize a bit on my part, there are some absolutely amazing additions that have been made to the canon in the now 11 years since the EU became Legends that I love with all my heart. But the EU also meant and still means a lot to me. I read Heir to the Empire when I was 12 years old, and it made this world that I already loved so much bigger, and a part of me is still kind of sad about that, to be honest. As Luke Skywalker himself said, no one is ever really gone. And that's true of the EU and Splinter of the Mind's Eye. Even though Splinter of the Mind's Eye, like everything else that was created before April 25th, 2014, is now considered to be non-canon, you can still see pieces of it all over the Star Wars universe. Mimban was in Solo, a Star Wars story, and is still this muddy mess of a planet, which makes me happy. The Kaiburr crystals, while they were technically mentioned in early drafts of the first script, their first appearance was in Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and they play a huge role in the current Star Wars canon. To greatly oversimplify it, they're these extremely rare crystals that are attuned to the Force that the Jedi and the Sith use to power their lightsabers. And we know from the cinematic masterpiece that is Rogue One, the only film of all time, I fear, that Kaiburr crystals were used to power the Death Star, which the Empire got from strip mining the few planets where they formed, including Jeddah, which we also saw in Rogue One, which was home to the Temple of Kaiburr. While Hidden Key, R.I.P. in Peace, Kings, and the Yuuzhan are no longer canon, we can still see pieces of them all over the Star Wars universe. Aliens being enslaved by the Empire to do hard, grueling, and often deadly labor. We see this in the Wookiees and in Chewbacca's backstory. Hell, in the Knights of Ren comic, Kylo Ren goes to Mimban to retrieve an ancient artifact known as the Mind Splinter. All these things have their origin in this strange little sequel that never was. And it's not just Splinter of the Mind's Eye. The fingerprints of the EU are all over the new canon. And while Splinter of the Mind's Eye is the non-canon sequel that never was, it has had a huge impact on Star Wars and launched the absolute behemoth that was the expanded universe. And I think that's pretty cool. Thanks so much for listening to all that, and until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. And may the Force be with you. Bye-bye.